Great. Thank you, Susan, for inviting me. I am delighted to be here. I don't typically talk at seminars at universities, so this is a real treat for me. I'm going to try to speak for about 40 minutes, and I've got, this is a brief history of regulatory policy around air pollution, but I will be broader than that. So, since this is a public health group, I will talk about public health and air pollution in vehicles to start off with, just to ground everybody in what we're talking about here, and hopefully hone in on your interests. Then we're going to backtrack a little bit and talk about a whirlwind tour of the evolution of emission standards and fuel economy greenhouse gas CO2 standards for motor vehicles in the major markets. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of a, hopefully a little story right in the middle there on Volkswagen. My organization was the group that did the testing that led to the discovery of Volkswagen being a, doing this to be I got to talk a little bit about climate change. It's been in the press a lot. The COP is going on right now in Poland, and then I'll just do some closing thoughts. This can be completely informal. If you have a question or something's not clear to you, fine to raise your hand or just shout it out. I will not throw me off. So I'm going to start with the big picture. Right now, the estimates are for 2016, there are 4.2 million deaths attributed to ambient air pollution. And that is ambient particulate matter, household air pollution, and ozone way down here. And then here are the air pollution related endpoints from cardiovascular disease to cancers, etc. 1 in 9 deaths worldwide caused by air pollution. When I first started way back in the 1990s, I remember that ozone, in New Jersey, ozone was the thing that everyone was really focused on. The Clean Air Act had just been done. And I literally remember some public health folks in New Jersey DP explaining that while the general public thinks that the soot from urban buses is really causing public health effects, it's the ozone that's really the problem. Now we know that those fine particles from urban buses are just as bad or worse than ground level ozone. So just last month, for the first time ever, the World Health Organization held a conference on air pollution in Geneva. And so while we've known for a while that air pollution is a contributor to public health consequences and endpoints, it's really been something that WHO has grasped on. They've done a beautiful job in their Breathe Life campaign that's only a couple of years old, really doing a nice job communicating all the statistics around why you should care about air pollution. 4th highest cause of death worldwide, trailing smoking, high blood pressure. You can tease out air pollution's contribution to the following diseases: 2.4 million of the heart disease deaths attributed to air pollution, 1.8 with lung disease and cancer, and then 1.4 from stroke. The transportation contribution to air pollution, both fine particles and ozone, will vary somewhat dramatically depending on the region or the city, etc., and the other sources that are available. I give a range of 12 to 70 for PM, but it really varies quite a lot, but it's significant. One of the things that the ICCT, my organization, has been working on for many, many years is trying to get world-class emission standards in the major markets. And that, in our view, China, India, Mexico, Brazil have been our main targets. And they are in blue here. Europe as well, Japan as well, the United States. Those are the countries that we've typically worked in. So all those countries, as of a couple weeks ago with Brazil, now have adopted clean diesel fuel and world-class emission standards. phasing in between now and 2023. That will have a dramatic effect on public health and black carbon and climate change, really dramatic. And so from our side, what I'm struggling with as the executive director is, where do we go next? Right? And so this graphic is a graphic that's going to be in our strategic plan, but you can see that, well, there's a lot of other countries here that are either higher than the countries that we've been worrying with, or just as large, and how do we focus on those? I was at a forum with legislators from Pakistan and other countries, and we got into a conversation. They were saying, well, our air pollution is really bad. You're showing us that India has done a lot. How did that happen? Right. And my answer was that, well, the ICCT has actually been working in India for more than 10 years. And other organizations have as well. And legitimate question from Pakistan saying, well, why are you working in Pakistan? And so we don't have enough resources to work everywhere, but in Pakistan, if the politics work, it certainly could be something that we do. This is relatively well known, that diesel exhaust causes cancer. That is a well-known conclusion, although I guess it's about 20 years old now. I think around 2000 is when that was finally. So here's an important, I mean, if you're reading the papers, you're reading all of the IPCC report that came out, looking at how challenging it is to keep global temperature increases below 1.5 degrees. This is a graphic which makes a very, very compelling case that in order to be successful in keeping global temperatures below 2 or 1.5 degrees, we need a combination of CO2 reductions and what we call short-lived climate pollutant reductions, so black carbon, methane, the HFCs. And if you just look at CO2 only, that's your blue line, you're way above 2. And with black carbon and methane, you're still, this is the yellow line, you're still way above 2. But if you combine them, you can stay under 2 and ideally under 1.5. And so that's a pretty compelling point. The other benefit of public health in terms of climate change is that much of the world can be more induced to take strong policy actions because of saving and dealing with the public health of their citizens immediately than it is with trying to deal with perhaps a more abstract notion of climate change that's happening. It's not really happening in the future anymore, but that's the general thing. So this is the end of my first section. So air pollution, certainly a major cause of adverse health effects. Heart and lung disease is one of them. WHO is using its considerable ability to now communicate a lot of that, and that's a terrific, relatively new contribution to this area. Transportation is a big contributor, both for fine particles, for ozone, with NOx, with hydrocarbons, with sulfates, etc. And you get a 2-for-1 there if you want to focus on fine particles and black carbon. There was an interesting study that came out. There's a lot of sources of fine particles. But if you want to deal with climate change, what matters is the fraction of those fine particles that are organic versus elemental carbon. The elemental carbon is really the black carbon. And diesel exhaust has a very, very large fraction of that black or elemental carbon. And so when you are trying to deal with both public health and climate change, diesel is a really good policy. I'll pause there for just a second. That's your primer, just to get you going. And now we're going to focus on a history of motor vehicle emission standards. So this is a fascinating fact. We live here in the United States. You probably don't know this, but most of the world's motor vehicle emission standards have started in California. And then they typically flow out to the rest of the United States, and then Europe adopts them later, and then the rest of the world adopts European standards. And that has been happening for decades. And it is a little odd that one state in the United States has that much influence. But it all started back here, and it all started actually with smog in Los Angeles, and then a Caltech chemist in the early 1950s named Hagen Schmidt, and there's still like a Hagen Schmidt ceremony and a Hagen Schmidt award out in California, who identified the source of the ozone as being from, at least partially, emissions from motor vehicles. It had first been blamed on a butadiene plant, right? And then there were other stationary sources, and they were shut down, and the smog didn't go away. And eventually they figured it out. And then California sort of led the way in regulating motor vehicle emissions, and so when the Clean Air Act was first established or adopted in 1970, California was given a waiver. California was allowed to set their own emission standards. And that structure exists to that day. And also very, very unusual in that you want to have a nationwide program for motor vehicle emission standards, fuel standards, and California can do their own thing.
Is that currently under challenge?
It's under challenge. Yeah. And I guess another point I'll make, if you have any questions about what's going on currently, I'm happy to answer them. I don't dig into that a lot because we can spend a lot of time doing it, but I'm happy to talk about it. Catalytic converters, 1970s, that's the metal box underneath your car. Onboard diagnostics, this is the check engine light that's on your car. When that goes on now, it's not like, what it means is that there's something wrong with your emission controls. That started in 1988, and even to this day, California is the leader on onboard diagnostics in the world. They're the one leading it. It's not US EPA, it's certainly not Europe. And when China adopted their most recent standard, they wanted to adopt what California has done. And this also feeds into the Volkswagen scandal, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Zero emission vehicle regulations, 1990. I don't know if anyone's seen Who Killed the Electric Car, right? But that was all about the General Motors EV1. California was very excited. And California realized, look, there's so much work that you have to do to make sure that motor vehicle emissions with engines are not only clean when they are produced, but they also maintain those emissions throughout the full useful life of the vehicle. Whereas electric vehicles wouldn't have any of those issues. And so they really cottoned upon that and tried to drive manufacturers to have a certain percentage of electric vehicles into their fleets. They were way too ambitious early on. If they were successful early on, I believe 10% of California's fleet would have been electric vehicles by 2003. Very, very ambitious. And so they set ambitious targets, they had to renegotiate, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, you could argue that in part the hybrids were because of this very ambitious policy. And I'll show you a slide a little later. It has now, 20 years later or more, been adopted in Europe. Similar policies have been adopted in Europe and adopted in China. California adopted greenhouse gas emission standards well ahead of EPA's ability to approve their waiver because greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, were not seen as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. But they did it, they're way ahead. And now they are sort of bringing programs together. This is their advanced clean car program. Republicans have been very good with air pollution, right? George Bush just died. He was terrific in the Clean Air Act 1990 amendment, which is an excellent statute. The folks that I used to work with at EPA up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, were big fans of George Bush. He pretty much took all of their recommendations. They're huge fans. Here's Ronald Reagan founding the California Resources Board. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is ozone in LA, fine particles in LA, black carbon in California. And what you're seeing is, here's years, and this is number of cars. So it basically shows economic growth, or growth in cars or trucks, and then the effectiveness of emission standards, driving down the emissions even with that level of growth. Right? Extremely impressive. That's when you're getting 90% reductions over and over and over again in order to keep that happening. And you can't read this, but I'm happy to make these slides available, but these are all the different programs that took place at the time. So now we're going to move to the United States, right? And so the folks that write the regulations for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Office of Transportation and Air Quality, where I used to work, I was one of 10 attorney advisors outside of the Office of General Counsel at EPA. EPA has been working very, very closely with California for many, many years. The graphic on the left here shows GDP, vehicle miles traveled, population, energy consumption, CO2 emissions, and then aggregate emissions of 6 common criteria pollutants, so lead and NOx and VOCs, etc. And you can see even with all this economic growth, you're still getting a 65% reduction in those emissions. EPA does a pretty nice job of putting out a trends report every 2 years where they do an update of what the emissions are and ambient air quality, really to show what the relationships are. So really, really big success story. I think when we all started, we didn't think that would be we were as successful as we are, but in part it's a really good partnership between government and manufacturers, where manufacturers do contribute a lot of data to be able to allow the government to set standards that are reasonable. So first Clean Air Act in 1970, requiring massive reductions in the automobiles by 1975. Those were a little bit over the skis at the moment. EPA, established by Richard Nixon. Here's an interesting point. So the law directs EPA to set health-based national ambient air quality standards for 6 pollutants. As public health professionals, I'm delighted to tell you that those standards can only be set based on public health, that cost cannot be taken into consideration. And that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and a fellow by the name of Justice Scalia agreed with that interpretation. Interesting. What that means is that the determination of Congress was, we need to tell the public what is good for their health and what is not good for their health, independent upon if we can achieve it or not. Right? We'll get there eventually. Right? It might be very, very costly, but we shouldn't somehow taint the way we're explaining what's going on to the public by incorporating cost into it. So I think that's a terrific policy. 1975, first generation of catalytic converters and unleaded gasoline introduced. This is a theme which I'll call out to your attention. Often you'll find that we need cleaner gasoline, cleaner fuels in order to enable the best motor vehicle emission standards. And here, while lead is a neurotoxin and really bad, one of the main reasons why it was taken out of gasoline was because it poisoned the catalytic converter. Interesting. And so in order to enable catalysts, we had to do lead gasoline. In 1981, new cars meet emission standards with 3-way catalysts that also reduce NOx emissions. 85, NOx and PM for heavy-duty vehicles. So we started with cars and we moved to heavy-duty vehicles. In 1990, diesel sulfur levels are set. Now we're in 1999 and 2000, and I was talking to Susan about this earlier. So in 1999, previously EPA had set some set of standards for fuels and then one set of standards for vehicles and back and forth. And here in 99, a woman by the name of Margot O'Gay decided, you know, we're going to do it together. We're going to regulate the fuels and we're going to regulate the vehicles in one regulation. It's going to be a systems approach. At the time, it seemed like a bad idea to take on both the oil and the auto industry at the same time in one particular regulation. But it also made sense, right? The manufacturers wanted to know without a shadow of a doubt that if they built vehicles dependent upon clean fuels, that those clean fuels would be there in the marketplace. And so it has worked surprisingly well. In 2000, EPA set NOx and PM standards for heavy-duty vehicles. This is one of the rules that I worked on. And those rules are still in effect. That rule went into effect starting in 2006 for low sulfur fuel, then 2007 for fine particles, and then a phase-in from 2010 to 2012 for low NOx. So that is EPA. And here is where a lot of the public health work happens. Whenever you do a regulation by executive order in the United States, the benefits must out. And so here you have Tier 2 regulation, that's the regulation I just showed you in 1999. The heavy-duty regulation in 2000 was this one, and then non-road in 2003. In all of those, it was a systems approach, so clean fuel and emission standards in the same one. Benefits calculated at 25, 70, and 83 billion. Cost to the industry to comply between 5 and 4 and 2. Net benefits are substantial, and the ratio 5 to 1, 16 to 1, and 40 to 1. The Congress had mandated that the benefits and costs of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 should be looked at. And there are two very, very big, interesting reports that are public that looked at all environmental regulations and find that some of the best ratios in terms of public health versus costs are found in the air pollution regulations for motor vehicles. Yep.
Can you explain how the benefits costs analysis works with the Clean Air Act not being able to look at costs?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for your question. So the Clean Air Act does not allow EPA to take costs into consideration when they are determining what healthy air is, what the national ambient air quality standards are. For ozone, 80 parts per billion, for PM, etc. This is different. This is how can we achieve those standards? And there you're supposed to take costs with it. But that's a great question. Trying to think of anything else I can say. There was a court case when I was at EPA brought by the American Trucking Association, claiming that because the health effects of fine particles did not have a lower bound at which there were no health effects. And so EPA set a particular standard, but they could have gone lower. The science allowed them to go lower. And what the Trucking Association argued was that this was an unconstitutional delegation of congressional authority to the executive branch. In other words, there's just too much power. They could do whatever they want. And there was some truth to that. The case was, and I was actually a relatively low-level bureaucrat at the time, saddled with the idea of creating the air quality case that would justify the heavy-duty standard. And what I argued internally was that even though these new standards are under a shroud of judicial review, the courts certainly agree that there are health effects far below the existing standards. That's not in contention at all. In fact, that's the basis of the litigation. And so in this standard, what we argued is that despite the fact that the new standards have this shroud of judicial uncertainty, the health effects that are found below the existing standards are something that we can calculate in the rule, and that's what we did. Otherwise, it would have been real hard to figure out. Okay.
Didn't the trucking industry also try to claim that the ground level ozone that they were being blamed for was a benefit because they were helping to plug the thinning hole in the ozone layer at the time?
That would be very creative. I don't know.
I think they tried. I don't know.
That one escaped me. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I'm realizing I'm being. So back in the good old days, EPA had regulated the auto industry so often, and the government owned some of the manufacturers. They would all come together and sort of have this sort of group agreement that they would all work together on regulations. This is, in my view, from a public policy perspective, this is what you want. Right? You want industry from a data-driven perspective. Industry brings their data, EPA brings their data, outside groups bring their data. We look at it, we figure out what the right course of action is. This is for the greenhouse gas emissions. This is a chart which, if you remember Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, back in, 2008, he had an earlier version of this, which didn't have nearly the number of lines or the number of, but you can see the annual rate of progress on fuel economy standards, about 1 or 2% annual rate of improvement, really going up to between 4 and 5%. pretty spectacular if it was going to happen, right? EPA standards, California and US and Canada standards might get rolled back. Though Europe is still on target to do that, and we're expecting that to be finalized, maybe even strengthened a little bit. But a huge amount of progress here. That's my 25 minute. Here is a little bit of a complicated chart. This is European standards. Europe, if you notice, so California 1960s, federal government 1970s and 80s. Europe gets into the business in 1992. So quite a lag, right? But this shows you just how effective the emission standards have been. And so this is diesel sulfur, and sulfur, like lead, is a catalyst poison. You need to get down to 10 parts per million in order to drive the emissions way down here. And so with each Euro 1, Euro 2, Euro 3, Euro 4, Euro 5, Euro 6, you're driving emissions down lower and lower and lower and lower. It's been very, very effective. China. So we have an office in China, in Beijing. We have some excellent staff there. This is a photo that I took at the Beijing Environmental Protection Bureau. This is Euro 2, Euro 3, Euro 4, Euro 5 heavy-duty truck. And this is PM collected in an hour. This was staggering even for me. This was my business, right? When I saw that, that was shocking to me. Right? I mean, that just hits home. Right? And you can see just how big the reductions are between Euro 3 and Euro 4, and then, so this is what's driving public health effects and climate. China, biggest market in the world for light and heavy duty vehicles, biggest producer in the world of passenger vehicles, and now of electric vehicles as well. And the government is very effective and extremely committed to cleaning up air pollution and transitioning to the electric vehicle. So whereas you had Europe, the United States, California as the leaders for many, many years, China is now at least on par. The US, depending on how the politics play out, is certainly moving backwards. And Europe has always been a little bit challenged. This is the China New Energy Vehicle Standard. This is the ZEV mandate China version. But I've also got Quebec and I've also got Europe here. These are the years, these are the credits, and these are the actual sales. I think I would say Europe has got a lot of ambition here, but Europe's standard is mainly voluntary.
Can I ask a question about
Yeah.
that? So does that mean, just to take advantage of this slide, does that mean that China soon will be able to offload its reputation of being a country with just terrible air? Do you foresee that? I see that they're on par with energy standards. Do you think that's going to lead to a rapid improvement in overall air quality in that country?
China is doing a great job of doing everything they possibly can. The sad truth about air pollution is that once you get into having significant air pollution problems, you're about 10 to 15 years out. I would love to have a global conference called Getting Ahead of the Curve, where we can spot countries and cities that are on the verge of rapid motorization and tell them, look, you've got to get ahead. If you put clean fuel and vehicle standards in place now, you won't have 20 years of air pollution. If you don't, that's what you will have. And we know it, right? We've seen it over and over and over again. So China is, somewhere they're expecting air pollution. They're expecting. The central government is asking all the experts, when can we expect clean air? I think the current answer is between 2030 and 2035. But they're way above World Health Organization standards. It just takes time. The vehicle changeover stuff. I'm a little bit running on time, so I'm going to move a little bit. I think I've covered all of these. Yeah. The last thing I'll say on this, though, is that electric vehicles and the transition to electric vehicles is now creating fascinating challenges for us and for the industry and for governments in terms of when do you and how much money do you put into cleaning up the existing vehicles and how much do you shift to just driving the transition to EVs. And it is a challenge. Volkswagen. I am going to tell you the story of Volkswagen, and then I'll give you some of the background. So in 2012, we have a European office in Berlin, and that European office became aware that there were a number of studies, somewhat anecdotal, that had found that trucks and cars, diesel in Europe, were emitting very, very high levels of NOx, well above the legal limits. And they went around to a variety of governments and couldn't get any governments to pay attention. So we had a little extra money at the end of the year, and a proposal came onto my desk to do some testing of light-duty diesel cars in the United States, the hypothesis being that those vehicles would be clean. We would then test them, take the results back to Europe and say, look, they can do it in the United States, you can do it here in Europe. That was the idea. The reason why we thought they were clean is because we knew full well that California and the US EPA had some of the most robust compliance and enforcement programs. We chose vehicles that were available and by their emission control system. So we chose the Volkswagen Jetta because it had something called a lean NOx trap. We chose the BMW X5 because it had something called SCR, selective catalytic reduction. These are both emission controls to deal with NOx emissions. And then we actually couldn't get a rental for a Passat, but we wanted to get a Passat because the Passat version in the US is very similar to one sold in Europe. And we found one on Craigslist. And I wrote a contract to rent it. Went out in California. My staff developed routes that the vehicles would be run on, rural, urban, hilly, etc. And the results came back, and we thought the emission testing equipment was broken because the emissions were so sky high, 25 to 40 times what they should be, just for the Volkswagens. Now, California gave us an in-kind contribution of use of their motor vehicle emission lab in El Monte. When they tested the vehicles under laboratory conditions, lo and behold, they were squeaky clean. Squeaky clean. We were very perplexed. This is called a portable emission monitor. It's a miniaturized lab. You put it in the back of a vehicle. You attach pipes to the tailpipe, and it collects the emissions. And here's what the laboratory tested. You put the vehicle in diamonds.
Can you tell us what you're testing? PAHs, PM 2.5.
We're testing everything, but we're testing NOx. NOx is the one that was sky high.
Okay.
So the average NOx emissions in grams per kilometer. Here is on the laboratory test, and here are the emissions going on. California deserves a huge amount of credit. When they got this information, they then started asking questions to Volkswagen, so did EPA. And Volkswagen said, gee, this does look... Oh, I sent an email to Stu Johnson, who's the head of the EPA program at the time. Said, you may want to look into this, Stu. I said, thanks very much, we'll look into it. They did, they realized there was an issue, they did a recall, voluntary recall, they said everything was fixed. California said, that's great. Would you mind bringing those vehicles back that are fixed? We just want to retest them. We retested those vehicles, now this is in... So we tested the vehicles in 2013, published in 2014. Yeah, in the summer of 2014, California starts talking to Volkswagen. The voluntary recalls that winter. In the spring of now 2015, California realizes that the vehicles aren't fixed. Things get a little more heated. gone on for a year. In the summer of 2015, a friend and colleague of mine by the name of Byron Bunker from the US EPA, he's the head of compliance at this point, tells Volkswagen, look, I am not going to permit, I'm not going to allow you to sell vehicles in the United States next year unless you come clean on what's going on with these diesels. And the US EPA alone in the world has the authority to do that. Out in California, Volkswagen had a private meeting with EPA and told them what was going on. In September of that year, there was a notice of violation issued by the agencies, including the Department of Justice, California, EPA, and FCC. And that has led to more than $20 billion in fines, civil penalties, criminal penalties, etc. So, what happens? Europeans start testing these vehicles. What do they find? These are the results from the German testing using real-world emissions, the same types of systems that we used for Euro 5 and Euro 6 vehicles. The orange line is the laboratory emission limit, and this is the NOx emissions that they found when they tested those vehicles. And so what we originally thought it was an anecdotal problem for a couple vehicles in Europe, turned out one manufacturer was cheating in the United States, and then lo and behold it turned out that almost the entire industry in Europe was using software that, if sold in the United States, would be an illegal defeat device. In Europe, this is still being debated as to whether or not this is illegal, for reasons which it would take me a long time to explain. It's a very, very fragmented system. But that was a big discovery. One of the things that we try to do is keep the findings about all of this excess emissions in the press and in front of governments, and so we work with Susan on the first global study to estimate the health impacts of real-world diesel NOx emissions. It was published in Nature. We're delighted about that. We define excess NOx emissions as those NOx emissions that are above the legal limit. And it turned out that not just light-duty vehicles, but also heavy-duty vehicles also had a lot of excess NOx emissions. Heavy-duty trucks and buses, 75% of the total. So that was a big study, very, very important. We refer to it a lot. Yeah?
What is it about the defeat device that allows lab conditions to not detect?
Right, so we don't actually, so great question, I should have said so. So a defeat device is not a device, poorly named. It is a software code which detects or uses sensors to detect whether or not a vehicle is being tested or whether or not it's just being driven by its operator. And it then directs the vehicle to either turn on or turn off the emission controls depending on where it is. Defeat device can be anything. So when you're putting a vehicle on a dynamometer at on a lab, the vehicle is being driven, it's accelerating, it's decelerating, but no one is turning the steering wheel. So somebody clever could say, well, if the vehicle is accelerating and decelerating without the steering wheel moving, you better keep those emissions super low. You could literally, I mean, in Europe, everybody knows exactly where the emission station, the testing centers are. It's literally programmed the coordinates, the geographic coordinates of those into your vehicle. If you are in this spot, go low. If not, turn off the emission. Why would they do it, is the other question the journalists asked me many, many times. Diesel engines are harder, the air pollution, PM and NOx, are harder to clean up than gasoline. So that for a four-door, so we've done a study, for a four-door sedan, gasoline versus diesel, roughly $400 to meet Tier 2 standards here in the United States, so world-class emission standards. Around $1,400, $1,000 more for diesel. Very, very difficult to make a profit on a diesel when you already have a more expensive engine of somewhere more than $1,000 and $1,000. Volkswagen's desire was to become a global leader, and it is a global leader, but very difficult to make the case that we're going to be competitive with gasoline chemicals. And yeah.
Can you give us an idea of how frequent criminal penalties are?
Criminal penalties are very infrequent. And in fact, they became more frequent after the financial meltdown. There's something called a Yates memo, which told the Department of Justice, don't delay criminal penalties trying to get as much civil as you can and then trade them away. They're no longer able to do that. And one of the first companies that got caught with that is Volkswagen. So great question. Yeah.
As hideous as all this is, and I'm not trying to justify the crime here, but on another diesel that's not cheap, I would imagine that real world results are going to be a little more elevated than lab results to some degree.
Yep.
Do you know, could you give us a sense for what that delta might be from a diesel that's doesn't have a cheek device on it?
Well, so this is a great question. So, and I would just say in general, not to focus on diesel, but just in general, right? So emission controls degrade over time. Manufacturers know that. Manufacturers also know that they have to keep those emissions under the legal limits for the full useful life of the vehicle, at least in the United States, right? And in Europe as well. And that full useful life of the vehicle is defined by regulation, and those regulations have been increasing it over time. I believe we started at 50,000 miles. Tier 2 went to 120,000 miles. Tier 3 is now at 150,000 miles. As a result, when manufacturers certify their brand new vehicle, they are between a half to a third of the actual legal limit. So they come in well below in order to give themselves headroom. If I see a manufacturer, if EPA sees a manufacturer that's just skating right under the line with a brand new vehicle, they're going to come testing that.
And that would be a lab test versus the lab test standard.
So now EPA and Europe as well, and the rest of the world is now starting to incorporate real-world emission testing. EPA's was a simple one-page notice to manufacturers to say, we're going to be testing your vehicles in real-world conditions. We're not telling you anything about it. Expect a little more mileage on those vehicles. We are now the unpredictable EPA. That was how EPA solved that problem. Europe did a longer regulatory process defining all the parameters. One other point which I can't remember. I'm a little bit at time. Talk a little bit about climate change, and then I'll wrap and we can just have a discussion. This is harkening back to December 2015. This is Christiana Figueres. This was with FCCC at the time. You know, she recognized he was the president of France. Transportation is about 20-25% of CO2 emissions overall, and life cycle carbon dioxide is certainly growing or projected to grow over time unless we do something about it. Here is, electric vehicles come up a lot. They should come up a lot. There's always the question of, well, okay, but if you're powered by coal, how bad are the emissions? What about the national grid? What happens in my state? If you go to a Tesla dealership, they have all that data to show you just how clean they are. It is staggering that you have an internal combustion engine gasoline. They're somewhere between 15 and 20, maybe 25% efficient. The electric motor, the induction motor, the reluctance motor that Tesla uses, for example, were 85, 90, more than 90% efficient. They're using magnets that just repel each other and spin. Very, very simple. You don't have a transmission in an electric vehicle. You don't have emission controls in an electric vehicle. You have a battery, and you have a converter or inverter, and you have your motor, and that's it. Very, very simple. But here in this, you've got conventional vehicles, you've got electric vehicles, you've got a variety of upstream losses, vehicle on-road losses, and required road load. You can see here that in 28 miles per gallon and 40 miles per gallon, we're expecting the US fleet to get to 40 if the 2025 standards continue, which they're not supposed to currently, given the current proposal. And electric vehicles using different levels of renewables, 20% and 40%, will have these levels, right? So even at a 20% renewable, which is currently what we have now, you're still cleaner than the entire fleet of internal combustion engines if it had achieved the adoption of the 2025 standards that are currently under light and low. Okay. That just gives you a sense. We could do a lot. This is a look from 2020 to 2050 of greenhouse gas emissions from the vehicle fleet, and a change from 2010. This would be business as usual. We think we can kind of tread water with efficiency standards, but we really need electric drive to bend the curve further. In a very, very simple way, that's the way we see it. I think you've heard of cost parity happening at some point with electric vehicles. I will say 3-4 years ago, there was a National Academy of Sciences study that I talked about saying that don't worry, by 2040, electric vehicles will be cheaper than internal combustion. I was going around the world saying there's a light at the end of the tunnel for all these subsidies, but it's not going to be until 2040. 18 months later, 2 years later, it's now somewhere around 2025. And now it's probably closer to 2020. When I mean cost parity, I don't mean full life cycle accounting. We're probably there now or close to that. I mean that on a per vehicle basis, your electric vehicle is going to be cheaper. Batteries are going to have to get around the same cost of an engine. Engine's around $5,000. Batteries somewhere around $10,000 now. So they've got a ways to go, but still doing very well. That's basically what that said. And here's my last slide, and I'm pretty good. I do find it fascinating that public awareness is growing both for climate change and for air pollution, and a recognition that if you work on both, you will be able to hit a lot of different public endpoints with the same policies and the same technologies. Policies, I have it here, are accelerating and converging. The United States, though, is the exception right now. The United States is pulling back. The good news there, though, is that Europe isn't really flinching. China is not flinching. The US, which has been a global leader in this area for decades, despite the fact now that they are pulling back, it doesn't seem to have ripple effects around the rest of the world, which is good. Cities, I was talking to Susan about this. Well, I'm a strong believer in national government setting good policies. We are out of time. And cities are more nimble and more aggressive. They don't have to worry about an incumbent manufacturing industry. And so we do a lot more work with cities now to try to complement national policies. And electric vehicles are going to need cities to drive with parking and with incentives and with consumer education, etc. So cities are becoming more and more of a player in this field, unexpectedly in my view. I've already talked about electric vehicle cost parity. I should mention also, it's not just passenger vehicles, there's also heavy-duty trucks. Buses are on an operational basis, have now already reached cost parity. And so if cities have the money, investing in electric buses makes a lot of sense for the most part. Long-haul tractor trailers, those are the big energy users in the heavy-duty vehicle fleet. Right? These are the big rigs that cross the country. We now have 3 different options for zero-emission technologies. We have hydrogen fuel cells, and there's a startup called Nikola out in Salt Lake City, and I believe they have a production facility in Arizona. that is creating a hydrogen fuel cell big rig. There is something called electric roadways that Siemens is working on out in Europe, where you know the buses that have catenary lines that have overhead wires that they use. This is basically taking main highways that trucks use to transport goods across countries and putting catenary lines on those, or inductive charging underneath the roadway. And then the final is something that no one expected, and it still seems a little bit outlandish, but putting batteries on big rigs. So this is Elon Musk, and he's saying that he can create a big rig with a battery and make it cost effective. China, I've mentioned a little bit, but China is driving a lot of these standards now. It used to be that California, the U.S. would set standards, Europe would adopt them, and the rest of the world would adopt European standards. No longer, really. So China set its own heavy-duty fuel economy standards ahead of Europe, because Europe was dragging its feet. China's latest Euro 6 standards now cherry-pick the best of different elements of standards around the world. So they adopted the California onboard diagnostic system, for example. They adopted the fine particle number system from Europe. And so they are creating their own vehicle, and they are certainly the large enough market to do that. And they've got the need for it. So China is a fascinating new player, not only in just industry, but also in government policy. I will stop there.